It's a sunny day out there, so thanks for joining us for the first all-Canadian edition of Tech Talks. Cory is from Toronto as well. Just to add to his bio, he's been a comic store clerk, an entrepreneur. As you know, he's a best-selling science fiction novelist, a blogger, a journalist, and an activist. He has a new job with the Electronic Frontier Foundation, heading up something called Apollo 1201. We'll go into that. And very sadly for me, because I'm very fond of Cory, he's moving very soon to California. So I guess before going into your backstory, let's go with what's happening next. What's taking you to California?
Well, I mean, the initial impetus is that my wife's business is expanding. She runs a 3D printing toy company near here called Makey Lab, and most of their sales are in the U.S. And so she's moving to the U.S. to open their office. And we've lived there before in Los Angeles, and I've lived in San Francisco as well. And I found it quite nice, nicer than it had any right to be, especially LA, which is nicer than anyone says it is. Then, you know, as you do, as soon as you make the decision, you start to find better reasons to go. And so I've got a long list now if anyone asks me why I'm leaving. And one is I'm being driven out of East London. You know, my office rent's doubled. My wife's office rent has doubled. Every building on our block has been torn down to build luxury residences for offshore plutocrats who want to have safe deposit boxes in the sky. The Baroque medieval freeholder system means that even though we own our flat, we don't own our flat, and our freeholder is trying to push us out so they can knock our building down and build safe deposit boxes in the sky for offshore plutocrats. So, you know, I can't really afford London anymore, and I guess I could move somewhere else, but in the UK. But I need a big airport, and I moved to London to the UK to live in a big city, and so this is sort of it. I have friends in Edinburgh who want to know why I'm not moving there. The other thing is that the direction of travel, again, this is all rationalization after we made the decision,
right.
But the direction of travel seems like it's going in the right way. So here we are doubling down on the evidence-free process of using standardized testing to build our education system around. We're doubling down on the evidence-free business of mass surveillance. We're doubling down on policies that increase the wealth gap. And in the US, there is a lively debate with policy outcomes that matter about the wealth gap. They've just passed the first surveillance reform in a generation, and the next week they passed 3 more in the House, and the next week they passed 2 more after that. And there are entire movements of parents who are boycotting the standardized testing system in the US who are saying, we're going to have all the kids in the school stay home on standardized test day next month, flunk the school, and daring the government to flunk the school. So it feels like, although it's terrible there, that the direction of travel is improving, and you know, I despair for the next 5 years here.
Wow. Well, that wasn't the answer that I was expecting. I'll
Right.
just tell you that. You don't seem to be someone who moves somewhere to avoid a fight, so we'll get to the EFF
Right.
in
Well, yeah, that's the other thing, is I wanted to wake up every morning apoplectic about the entertainment industry instead of the finance industry for a decade. So.
But you're moving to California to rejoin the same organization that initially brought you here. Tell us about the role with EFF.
So yeah, Electronic Frontier Foundation, it's a nonprofit NGO. I started working for them in the early 2000s, and I became their European director. I moved here to run their European operation, mostly working on standards and treaties in Brussels and in Geneva. And I could have lived either of those places, but I chose London because it's not Brussels or Geneva. And I quit to write full time. I'd always told my boss that when it got to the point where I was having to kind of choose between getting my job done properly and writing, that I would write full time. My boss was very understanding about it. She totally was on board with that. And then I spent 10 years writing novels that did very well and supported me and my family. And after 10 years of this, I kind of turned around and looked at what was happening in the world of technology and policy, and thought that there are ways in which it's getting extremely bad and very alarming. And when I started thinking about it, I started to think about ways that we could fix it. And I came up with a kind of grandiose plan to eliminate one of the worst technology policies, which is the law that prohibits removing digital locks or telling people how to remove digital locks, even from things they own, which has lots of implications for security, because it means you can't tell people about flaws in devices they own, because they could use those flaws to remove the digital locks. So we end up with these long-lived reservoirs of digital pathogens and devices that are increasingly intimate with our lives. And I came up with a way to eliminate those policies all over the world in a decade, which is why it's called the Apollo 1201 project. Apollo was the 10-year project to put a man on the moon, and 1201 is the section of the American Copyright Act, Digital Millennium Copyright Act, that sets out this policy. And I bounced it off EFF a couple of times last year and said, you guys should really think about doing this. And they kept saying, that sounds great, but we don't have anyone who could do that. We're all busy. And I took the hint and I said, would you like me to come and do this? And they said, we would love you to come and do this. So now I'm there doing it.
How will it help you to be based there?
Oh, it just means I get to have dinner for a change instead of having to be on a phone call every night at dinner time. And it means that I don't have to spend nearly quite so much time destroying the planet crossing the stupid ocean, which is just like, in addition to destroying my health, has sucked up an infinite number of hours of my life while making me apoplectic at people whose only crime is to be so economically desperate they go to work for the TSA. So, you know, it'll be nice to kind of be in a place where I don't have to travel nearly so much.
Is it just that, I mean, maybe we should go back a second and just explain sort of digital rights management and your take on that. Because, you know, Cory's obviously in an interesting position, being a content creator himself, relying on having, I think, you know, a paying audience for his work for at least a portion of your livelihood, but also is a proponent of openness, shares his works for free on his website, craphound.com, and also allows people to rework his works through Creative Commons, and doesn't allow his work to go on sites like Audible, which feature DRM, except for a German version of one of your books, by the way.
Well, send that to me and I'll fix it.
Okay. What is your objection? I mean, this is a big question.
Sure.
What is your objection to DRM?
So I think that we can talk about my objection as a purchaser, as a creator, and then in a wider policy sense. So as a purchaser, the digital locks, the way that the law works around them, is a kind of moral hazard. So normally businesses, when they put impediments in the way of their customers adding value to the products they buy, there's a kind of equilibrium where if the impediment is too high, right, if fitting a spare is too expensive if you buy original parts, someone comes in to fill that market void. I mean, markets don't solve all of our problems, but if you make a coffee machine that works quite well but has really crummy pods, someone makes better pods, right? That is a story we actually just saw played out. In the absence of any other legal impediment, that's a thing we can expect to see. Digital rights management is underpinned by policy. In the EU, it's the European Union Copyright Directive 2001 that prohibits breaking a digital lock, even if you're doing it for a lawful purpose. And so what it invites firms to do is to disrupt the natural equilibrium in which customers who've bought into an ecosystem can't be treated as kind of ambulatory wallets who can be gouged for spares and extra stuff, and instead can look to other vendors to enter the market to say, oh, well, if you're charging a whole lot for spares, I can charge less. Or if you're operating a marketplace that limits functionality, you know, you're only allowing people to record shows for 7 days, but not indefinitely, I'll make a PVR that has this feature that everybody wants. But in the absence or in the presence of this rule, you don't get that kind of natural correction. And so this plays out in lots of ways that kind of rip you off and are bad. You know, if you take a CD and you stick it in your computer's optical drive, it wakes up a piece of software supplied by the manufacturer whose original slogan was rip, mix, burn, and says, would you like to transcode this so you can take it with you on your mobile device? All even loaded on your mobile device for you. If you put a DVD in, it won't. All it'll let you do with the DVD is watch it, because the DVD has a digital lock on it. And although ripping a DVD and moving a DVD to a device is no more illegal or legal than doing this with the music on a CD, breaking the lock is illegal. And so what you're expected to do with that DVD is buy the movie again for your mobile device. It's a kind of urinary tract infection business model, right? Instead of the value flowing in a healthy gush where you take a CD and then it turns into ringtones and alarm tones and streams and backups and soundtracks for YouTube videos and anything else you can think of, with things that start with a digital lock, everything is a price tag attached to it. It comes in a slow, burning, painful dribble. So that's the kind of consumer story. As a creator, the problem with allowing someone to put a digital lock on something that I made is that only they can authorize the removal of that lock. So if I allow Amazon to sell my audiobooks through Audible, only Audible can authorize the removal of the lock. And only by removing the lock can things be moved from Audible's platform to one of their rivals. So what happens is the more work I sell through Audible, the higher the switching cost is for my customers, if I decide to leave Audible and they want to follow me to somewhere else. And Amazon understands this. So Hachette, which is one of the big 5 publishers, Hachette has always insisted on DRM. They're the most dogmatic of all the publishers. Last year, they were the first of the big 5 publishers to have their standard deal with Amazon expire. They do these 10-year deals. And Amazon wanted more from them. And they said no. And Amazon delisted all of their books from the Amazon store in the US. You couldn't buy J.K. Rowling. And rather than Hachette being able to take out bus ads that said, download our app, convert your Amazon books to any other platform, all of our books are half price everywhere else because we love J.K. Rowling and so do you. Amazon was able to cast them as the bullies, as the ones who were intransigent. And in the end, they had to give in. And Random House is doing it next. Random House's deal is just about to come up. They've already signaled that they're having a dispute with Amazon. So I want to be in control of my destiny, right? I think that it's grotesque that someone whose only contribution to my copyrighted work is to transcode it has more of a say in it than me, who created it, or my publisher who invested in it, right? Of all the parties who have a legitimate claim to that copyright, it certainly isn't the company that processed it through a script and then sold it, right? And then finally there's this policy dimension, and I mentioned this before. It's not really technologically plausible to put a lock on something and then send it home with someone you don't trust. So when you put a lock on an iPhone and you give it to anyone who wants to buy an iPhone, including bored grad students with their own electron tunneling microscopes, someone will figure out how to remove that lock from the iPhone. And so instead of acknowledging that reality and saying, well, this is just kind of a dumb way to make a living, industry and government, starting in the mid-90s, started passing these laws that prohibit removing the locks and prohibit giving people information they could use to remove the locks. And that includes information about flaws in implementations of software. And so this is a really bad thing because we only have one experimental methodology for discovering security vulnerabilities, and that's disclosure. Right? Anyone can design a security system that works so well that he himself can't think of a way of breaking it, but all that means is you've made a security system that works on people who are stupider than you. Unless you subject it to scrutiny, you are unable to uncover the self-deception, the blind spots, and the errors, the human errors that you've introduced. And an error that lingers in your phone or your browser, or increasingly in your smart building, this building is a computer we share living quarters with. If you take the computers out of this building, the lack of climate control will make it almost immediately uninhabitable. Leave it out of this building for any length of time, and the rising damp will fill the building with black mold, and you'll have to scrape it down to the foundation stones and start over again. And it's not just these buildings. If you know those sort of willowy, ridiculous Starkitect towers that are going up in every city's financial district, and you look at them and you ask yourself, how does something that tall and narrow stay upright? It uses computer-based dynamic load adjustments to compensate for seismic and wind stresses, take the computers out of those buildings, and they fall over. And so prohibiting the disclosure of vulnerabilities in computers means that things that are integral to our well-being, the things that we put our bodies inside of and inside of our bodies, fester as reservoirs of long-lived digital pathogens. Your phone is not a destruction rectangle that you use to throw birds at pigs. It's a supercomputer in your pocket that knows who all your friends are and everything you've ever said to them and all the things they said to you and where you were when you were talking about it and what your solicitor sent you last week and how to look at your medical records and how to double down on your mortgage or sell your house. And it has a camera and a microphone, and you take it into the toilet and into the bedroom, and the only way you know if those things are off is by trusting the operating system. And so setting up structural impediments to disclosing vulnerabilities is an awful, terrible idea. And the idea that it's being done in the name of making sure that I get paid as an artist, I feel like gives me a special moral responsibility to reject it.
So if we flip to your role at EFF, how do you, through that organization, take on the likes of Amazon and Apple? And I guess even this, to some extent, pits you against Tim Berners-Lee, because this stuff you're talking about isn't HTML5.
Well, we're going to do something different with HTML5, but in the case of everything else, we have a tactic that as a Canadian growing up I never quite understood, and I think a lot of Europeans don't quite get, which is impact litigation. Because barring the European Court of Justice, there isn't a lot of instances in which laws that are made by sitting legislatures are overturned by judges with recourse to a strong constitutional tradition. And in the United States, what you get with the independent judiciary is a legislator of second resort. And on the one hand, that can be really bad, because what it does is it frees up legislators to make laws that are incredibly stupid but play well to the gallery, and they know that a judge is going to knock them down again, and then they can kind of pull their hair out and complain about activist judges. But on the other hand, it means that when the legislature is compromised or is making policy that has no connection with evidence, that you can bring a constitutional challenge before a judge. And this is something EFF is exceptionally good at. So in the early days of the internet, the NSA prohibited the civilian access to strong cryptography. And they only allowed very weak forms of crypto into civilian hands. When I say very weak, John Gilmore, who was one of the founders of EFF and an early employee at Sun, and who also founded the first dial-up ISP, he wanted to prove that this wasn't fit for use in business. And so he designed a computer and built it for $250,000. And it was able to crack anything encrypted with the cipher that the NSA would let civilian use in 2 hours. So it was like, if you're the mafia or a spy from a rival government and you want to interfere with, intercept, or spoof American financial traffic, confidential information, anything like that, your total investment is $250,000 in 2 hours to get into it. Nobody cared. Congress was like, well, the NSA says one thing, the evidence says something else, we're going with the NSA. But we brought a suit on behalf of a mathematician, a guy named Daniel J. Bernstein, who at the time was an academic at the University of California at Berkeley. And Daniel had published source code programs that could be used to create strong ciphers that were stronger than the ones the NSA allowed. And we argued that his source code was a form of expressive speech protected under the First Amendment. And not only did the Ninth Circuit uphold us, but they upheld us on appeal. And that was the end of it, right? That was the end of the prohibition on strong crypto. Well, source code that circumvents has exactly the same characteristics as source code that embodies a strong cipher. It is also a form of speech. The trick is to find a client who is, on the one hand, unimpeachable. The judge was, one of the reasons the judge was willing to give Bernstein his victory was because there's something unseemly about telling a maths professor that he can't talk about maths, right? And on the other hand, that person needs to be doing something that's so provocative that the other side sues. So we haven't had much chance to litigate this question. Actually, the DMCA has been on the books since 1998, and although threats arise under the DMCA all the time, the amount of litigation on this question, on Section 1201, is super, super sparse. And in part, that's because the other side gets to choose its field. So they sue weak defendants who have bad facts, and they establish precedents that kind of shore up the idea that if you break the DMCA, the judge won't like you. And then they run away from defendants with good facts. So Edward Felton, who's now the deputy CTO of the White House, was our client when he was an eminent computer scientist at Princeton. And he and several of his colleagues had examined a digital rights management system called SDMI, the Secure Digital Music Initiative. And they submitted it to the 10th Usenix Security Symposium, a learned conference on security and computer science. And the Recording Industry Association of America threatened to sue Ed, his colleagues, and the journal and conference where his paper was to be published. And this was the case we'd always been waiting for, right? I mean, please let us ask a judge whether record executives should be allowed to tell eminent engineers what kind of statistics they're allowed to discuss at learned conferences, because we think we know what the answer to that one is, right? And when they saw that we were going to defend Ed, they dropped the case. They promised they would never sue Ed over it. They got the Department of Justice to give us a covenant saying they would never seek criminal damages from Ed over it. They basically ran away as fast as they could. We still tried to get a declaratory judgment out of the judge, and the judge said, "No, I'm sorry, you don't have a threat, so you don't have you don't have standing to seek a judgment." But if we can get someone to do something provocative enough that they'll get sued, but who is has the kind of formal characteristics of someone like Ed Felton or Dan Bernstein, we can win a judgment. Even if we win that judgment, there will be a long period during which it's litigated back and forth. It's become too integral to so many businesses' strategies that for a judge to allow it to stand, there will be appeal and appeal and appeal. You may have seen that just recently the John Deere company who make tractors told the Copyright Office not to let farmers remove the DRM from their tractors so that they can go to independent mechanics who buy spares from third parties. Deere wants to make sure it's like inkjet cartridges, right? They want to make sure you buy your parts for your John Deere from John Deere and not from a third party. And so they told the Copyright Office to tell farmers that you can't own a tractor, that you can only license it because the firmware in the motor can't ever be truly transferred to you. And then, in case there was any doubt, GM came along and said, we'd like to support John Deere in this because the same is true of our cars, right? Like, you know that GM slogan, not your father's Oldsmobile? They meant it literally, right? Your father can't own that Oldsmobile, it's still ours, right? And so there's too many powerful entities who rely on this for us to be able to plow on with it. And so we anticipate 10 years of litigation. And we want to make use of that because all over the world there are versions of the DMCA. There's one here, the EUCD, which was embodied in a Copyright Act, I think in 2002. And everywhere else there's these acts as well. And we think that as the US is teetering on the brink of repealing it, that's a moment at which activists and industry can work together to seek repeal there. Because once American businesses start building circumvention tools and enjoying the profits from them. Because remember, the only reason to use a DRM is to extract monopoly rents from an ecosystem, right? And as Jeff Bezos told the booksellers, your margin is my opportunity. So there is a business everywhere there's a DRM. Start another app store and cherry pick Apple's 25 most successful ISVs and offer them a 15% commission instead of a 30% commission, and then split the difference and sell their wares at a 15% discount, and you'll suck up maybe 10% of Apple's business, at which point you're taking a piece out of the most profitable company in the history of the world, right? There are innumerable opportunities on those lines, and if we don't start circumventing here, it doesn't mean Britons won't be availing themselves of this technology. It just means they'll be paying American firms for it. And what we've seen in technology fights is that when activists and industry are on the same side, you can't predict the outcome. Normally you can handicap outcomes by spending, but if you look at, say, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was the fast track for which was just defeated in the Congress. It's a secret trade deal like ACTA, and the Obama administration had been seeking to pass it without debate. And activists were on the side of an industry group that also didn't want it because they correctly anticipated that a lot of their oxen would be gored by TPP, and a much larger industry body that outspent them 10-1 was in favor of fast track, and they were defeated. Just as in net neutrality, you had an important defeat of a much better funded lobby by a smaller industry body backed by a very large and vocal activist community. Same with the SOPA and PIPA fights. So you have this magic situation, right, where people starting businesses that give people what they want can contribute to a climate in which a dangerous technology situation can be knocked out.
It sounds, I mean, it's amazing because you strike me as one of the guys that, like, in one of those sort of science fiction films at the beginning who said, like, who kind of highlights the problem but can't get anyone to listen.
Can't you see? We all live in a jar of Tang.
Kind of like that.
Soylent Green is people.
Yeah, so, I mean, does it matter if most people don't understand most of this?
Yeah, no, you don't have to understand this. What you need to understand, like the minimum viable comprehension for this is you're being ripped off and you can buy this thing and it won't rip you off. The next one up is people are being ripped off and you can make money helping them stop being ripped off. Like those two, if you can grasp either one of those, you've got a role to play.
Okay. Let me ask you about what happened, the rest of your career. What happens when you move into this EFF role? You've got, you're a writer and you're a journalist and a blogger. Are you going to still be writing books? I mean,
I just brought you my manuscript. I just finished a 220,000 word novel.
Yeah.
And I write quickly and with a lot of discipline. I started writing novels when I was working for EFF as their international director. I was in 31 countries in 3 years. I traveled 27 days a month. I didn't even plug in my fridge. And I was writing a novel a year.
And do you think that you can help other artists or creators understand how to survive the digital age? I mean, this is basically what this book is about, right? Information does not want to be free or doesn't want to be free,
right?
Which is a fantastic, interesting book. And I remember years and years ago watching a documentary where Marshall McLuhan said, if you want to know where our society's heading, look at what the artists are doing. And I think he meant creatively, but when you look at what's happening with artists' lives, obviously there might be a lesson for the rest of us.
So this book is not about what business models work.
Right.
This is about what policies ensure that whatever business models are working, that they divert the lion's share of the money first to artists and second to their investors, to the publishers and studios. So the first policy recommendation is that, on the one hand, artists and their investors should choose not to allow digital locks to be put on their works, just because it removes their negotiating leverage with these intermediaries who are running circles around them. I mean, look, Amazon and the publishers and Netflix and the film studios and so on. You know, they are rightfully terrified of these extremely dominant distribution platforms that have become their primary retail mechanism. I mean, Audible controls 90% of the audiobook market. Amazon's 40-something% of the book market.
And there are alternatives, which I only found out about because you were not on Audible.
Right. So yeah, I use Downpour, which is a tiny little pimple on the bum of Audible in terms of its sales. But at least finally there's someone who will sell my audiobooks without DRM. And so getting locked into someone else's platform means that you become commodified to them. And moreover, when the platform is also a competitor of yours, which is true for the publishers, right? Amazon is a publisher and retails the publishers. And so it gets an astounding amount of market intelligence that publishers aren't privy to. The last novel I was out on tour with was Homeland. Yeah. And I was in 23 cities in 25 days. It hit the New York Times bestseller list on like day 2. And everywhere I went, I saw friends, and they said, "How's the book doing?" And I'm saying, "Week 3 on the New York Times bestseller list." And they'd say, how many copies is that? And I'd say, "Ask me again in 180 days when Amazon tells my publisher." Yeah. Right? So Amazon knows to the second how many copies I'm selling. And Amazon knows who they sell to and like where they are and what else they buy and what else they've ever bought and all of their demographics and tons of other information about them. And my publisher has none of that. And so as a competitor, they can't really, they need to be sure that they're not locking themselves into Amazon, because Amazon's not there for their benefit. And then the second policy recommendation is about the way that artists and their investors interact with each other and how that interacts with copyright law. So really basic, uncontroversial economics is that when you have fewer buyers, the prices don't go as high as they would, and sellers don't fare as well. And we're down to 4 record labels, 5 publishers, and 5 movie studios. There are a lot fewer buyers than there used to be. And the standard deal across the arts is in decline. Publishers now ask authors, as a matter of course, to give up not just their territorial English rights, that would either be UK and Commonwealth, or Canada, US English rights, which are the normal split. They now ask for worldwide English rights. Sometimes they ask for translation rights, and then graphic novel rights and audiobook rights increasingly. That's all money that you used to be able to trouser yourself as an author, because you could sell those rights separately. If you're a musician, it's even worse. Musicians sign deals where when they sign with a label, where they have to agree to a fixed percentage of every royalty statement being deducted for breakage. And this is a line item that goes back to the turn of the 20th century, and it relates to the fraction of shellac record albums that you can expect to be broken between the factory and the high street retailer. And that percentage is deducted from your digital music revenues, right? And the accounting logic for that is, fuck you, there's only 4 of us, right? If you don't like it, go somewhere else, right? What people have been able to do increasingly is go somewhere else. They've been able to walk away from the system and create an independent publisher, an independent label, an independent studio by finding pieces lying around on the internet. Here's a payment processor, there's a search engine, here's a video hosting service, there's a publishing service that'll list you in the Ingram catalog and so on, and they kind of bodge together a publisher. And the worst deal a publisher can offer us has to be better than the best deal we rationally believe we can get for ourselves if we follow them. So it follows that the more competitors of last resort we have, the better the deal we can negotiate from our publishers, the more money we get to put in our pockets. But the sector that provides all those services has been in a system of continually mounting compliance burdens related to copyright since it was started. And new entrants into those fields have all stalled, in large part thanks to copyright compliance. So when YouTube started, it took 3 people, a large pile of hard drives, a garage, and an unhealthy interest in video. To start YouTube today, you need all of that and $100 million worth of compliance software to do content ID matching, to make sure that you can have a database of all the copyrighted works and make sure you're doing preemptive takedown of material. we don't have any real competitors to YouTube. When YouTube started, it was an open field. Now it's an extremely stable field. And the barriers to entry are going to keep it largely stable, except for other firms that have comparable outcomes and victory conditions to YouTube. So Microsoft might enter, or Facebook might enter. But you're not going to get 3 guys in a garage who have totally different economics and who are really, really desperate for the business of creators and who are willing to offer them a better deal. And that's true in distribution, it's true in payment processing, it's true in network services and hosting and so on. As those services contract, we can see that the deals they offer to creators are also getting worse. So YouTube recently launched a Spotify competitor, and it called the 4 record labels to a room, and it held a closed-door negotiation, and it said, let's find terms on which you're comfortable letting us stream your music. Having negotiated with the Big 4, it went out to all the independents and said, the Big 4 have told us what your deal is, and if you don't take it, you can no longer use YouTube to promote your material. And so all those independents who are completely dependent on YouTube are now in a position where the Big 4 are setting terms for them. The new boss has become the old boss. YouTube has become an arm of the RIA, of IFPI, of the BPI. And so in that world, we have fewer buyers for our material, and so our rights are not worth as much as they were when there were more of it. And the irony is that so much of this is done in our name. It's done to prevent piracy and help artists. And so this is an area where artists can really have some voice, because if we stand up and say, no, that's not helping us. We want lots of alternatives. You know, just because they say they're on our side doesn't mean we're on their side. Bertelsmann is not a charity. They don't publish my books out of the goodness of their heart. Right. If they can get an extra dime out of me, they will, right? And so I need means by which I can keep as much of the money as possible in my pocket, and lawmakers don't help when they set up these rules.
So just finally, before we go to questions from the audience, you wrote recently in The Guardian about internet utopianism, or utopians, and you referenced John Perry Barlow's 1996 Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace, which is basically, you know, the rules of the physical world, of industry don't apply there. And then you referenced how we sort of progressed into hustling sort of startup entrepreneurs to sort of techno monopolies that we sort of see today. Do we have any reason for optimism?
I'm not a fan of optimism or pessimism. You know, I'm a science fiction writer, and optimism and pessimism are both predictions about the future. Science fiction writers shouldn't make predictions about the future for the same reason drug dealers shouldn't sample their product, right? It never ends well. And besides, it doesn't matter, right? If you were pessimistic about the future, and you thought that in the future networks would progress to the point where they formed a nexus of totalitarian control and surveillance that made, you know, Orwell look like a Teletubby, you would get out of bed every morning and do everything you could to try and make sure that your daughter grew up in a world where that wasn't the case, right? And if you were optimistic and you thought in the future networks would unlock ways for us to work together, to share with one another, to pool our efforts, to have greater transparency and responsiveness in government and democracy, you would get up every morning and do exactly the same thing, right? So why be optimistic or pessimistic? Hope is a much more interesting emotion to experience than optimism or pessimism. Hope is the condition in which you try even though you know that you may not get it, right? It's why you tread water after your ship sinks, even though you know most people who ship sink never get rescued. Because everybody who's ever rescued treaded water until rescue arrived, right? It's a necessary but insufficient condition. And the amazing thing about hope is if you have hope, it gives you strength. And so if your ship sunk and there was someone with you you loved who couldn't kick for themselves, you would kick for them. You put their arms around your neck and you kick for them until you couldn't kick anymore. And we are surrounded by people who don't yet understand the problems of technology, who can't kick for themselves. We have not reached peak surveillance by any means, but we've certainly reached peak indifference to surveillance. You know, as the years go by, there will never be a time in which fewer people care about this stuff. And as we're waiting for those people to figure out what's going on, to teach themselves to kick, we have a duty to bring them along with us, right? To hope for them as well. So hope is a thing that's worth doing, because what's the alternative, right? Just don't get out of bed. And hope is a reason to get out of bed.
I'm going to miss you hugely, and Alice, and of course, Posey. So thank you so much for spending your precious time.
Thank you. Thanks.